I'm Richard E. Turley Jr., and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Barbara Jones Brown and Rick Turley. This time we're going to dive into some deep theological topics, blood atonement, and also Parley P. Pratt's murder. Was Mountain Meadows a result of the Pratt murder? We'll talk more about that, as well as Brigham Young's role in the cover-up. So you don't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. I know another thing that Will spent some time in his book on, I'd be curious to have you guys talk about, is blood atonement. The idea was these guys were so bad. I mean, well, plus you have the Reformation in the 1850s, and there wasn't any discussion about blood atonement in your book.
There were several pages on blood atonement.
Okay, well, correct me then. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this was in one of the chapters that I wrote. And so again, I wanted to dig really deeply into what blood atonement was. And so we have several quotes from Brigham Young when he says, and they're pretty damning, pretty horrible, but he says that there are some sins that cannot be atoned for by Christ's blood. There are some sins that are so serious that they only can be atoned for by the blood of the man, or in other words, the man who committed these sins. And those sins appear to be murder and repeated adultery. And so it's pretty chilling. So again, there's several pages in which we delve into blood atonement and talk about it. And then we also have a case in August of 1857 in which Isaac Haight, again, who's the Cedar City state president, and this is just before the Mountain Meadows Massacre, he has a man in his stake who confesses to repeated adultery, and he offers himself up to be blood atoned for his sins so that he can go to the celestial kingdom. And so that takes place in 1857. And we know that it happened because Haight writes a letter about it to Brigham Young explaining, what he's going to do and talking about blood atonement. So on another note, I have...
Was he blood atoned?
Yeah. Yes.
He was?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. He offers himself up to be blood atoned. With blood atonement, there's a misunderstanding of that doctrine. And if you look closely at it, someone had to offer themselves to be blood atoned if they knew they had committed one of these very serious sins. And that was the case with Rasmus and Anderson. Again, that's in chapter 2 or 3. People can read about that.
So that could not be the basis for the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Yeah.
Those are not people who are giving themselves off.
And they weren't guilty of anything.
They weren't guilty of anything. And Brigham Young, in his journal in August of 1857, says, I do not want to have anything against me in the next life from any of my enemies. And therefore, I don't want to have anybody attacked who hasn't been warned and given the opportunity to move on. He says, I want to be basically clear in the judgment bar. And he also has a conversation with Wilford Woodruff, in which Wilford Woodruff says, well, what would happen if we were asked at some point to
avenge the blood of
the prophets, which is another thing that Will Bagley's book is named after that. Mm-hmm. Well, what would we do? And Brigham Young says, well, I'm confident we would never be asked to wipe out a large group of people until we were pure enough as a people to be able to distinguish the innocent from the guilty. And he basically says, hey, we're not there now. So it's very clear from Brigham Young's journal entries that this is not blood atonement and it's not avenging the blood of the prophets.
And so you're saying blood atonement has no role in the killing of the immigrants?
In the immigrants, yes. I think it does have a role in that if you're preaching that kind of violent doctrine, that it kind of can lead people to violence. So, and again, this case that we have in August of 1857, Cedar City, Utah, it's Isaac Haight that's writing Young about it and who's making sure it's carried out. And Philip Klingensmith is involved, another perpetrator of the crime. So it gives them a mindset of, violence is what we do.
And Brigham Young had been speaking, and other general church leaders in Utah Territory had been speaking during the period of the Reformation leading up to 1857, 1856 to 1858, they've been using very, very strong rhetoric, such as talking about blood atonement. What is described in our book, quoting one of the leaders, as preaching with pitchforks tines downward. It was intended to prick the hearts of people and wake them up spiritually and so forth. But while that was going on publicly, privately, Brigham Young was being forgiving. He was telling people, for example, Isaac Haight writes to him and says, I've got somebody that I think is really bad. And Brigham Young writes back and says, well, forgive them. I think his feeling is, I'll talk strongly in public, but privately I will do what I can to prevent people from going overboard and becoming fanatical. But the problem, as Barbara pointed out, is that there are going to be people who don't get the second message. And they're the ones who are naturally inclined to be extremists. And then they take license from the extreme rhetoric.
And so, because I know, Barbara, I told you off camera a month ago in our interview on the first book that you said that Brigham Young was guilty of creating the atmosphere in which this could have happened. So, I mean, how much blame can we attribute Brigham Young to creating the atmosphere where, I mean, it sounds like the people in southern Utah felt like, well, this is something Brigham would support, even though he didn't.
Yeah, I think that's very telling because an incident that's most telling of that is Isaac Haight sends an express message to Brigham Young saying, what should we do? There's these immigrants that are holed up at the Mountain Meadows. We're having some problems with them. What should we do with them? Young writes back, of course, and says, if they will go in peace, let them go. Haight is eager he carries out the massacre on September 11th before that message gets back from Young.
Yeah,
and
that
when
message was on like the 7th.
The letter from Young arrives in Cedar City on September 13th, Sunday morning.
So
and
the
Haight
massacre's already over now.
Yes, and he is eager to get that letter from Young. And to me, that shows he's hoping that maybe Young will say, yeah, go ahead and do this, that somehow he will approve of it. So when he gets it and it says, let them go, he says he cries like a baby and says, too late, too late. But just the fact that he thought, well, maybe would Brigham Young maybe approve of what I've done?
But he had enough doubt that he wondered.
Yeah,
and one of the big questions is, why didn't he just wait?
I think
Well, it would have taken 2 weeks.
I think it's
right?
because, well,
he had another immigrant company backed up that was about to go through.
There was another combined company of immigrants, the Turner Dukes and Collins Company. They were just right on the heels. They were just about to pass through the Mountain Meadows. They weren't far away from the Mountain Meadows. And I think they decided, we got to take care of this fast before this other company gets here. And then we have twice as many witnesses of what's going on.
And at the same time, Brigham Young he's got an army on his doorstep. He doesn't want to do anything. I mean, what the saints learned, their civics lessons in Missouri and Illinois taught them that if you are a persecuted minority, you're held to a much higher standard than people in the majority. And that's always been true in America. If you are the majority and you have, say, a racial minority, let's just take an example of a racial instance. So suppose that you are in the Deep South and you are an African American and you look askance at a white woman. All it takes is local people to interpret you did something wrong, and you'll be lynched for that and possibly tortured before the lynching.
Emmett Till.
Emmett Till is the good example of that, okay? And that's the standard to which they hold the minority. But what is the standard to which the majority holds itself? A black woman could be raped by a white man and nothing would be done to the white man in that same time period. So there's this difference between the standards to which you hold people. Well, the Latter-day Saints, as a religious minority in Missouri and Illinois, learned that they were held to an extremely high standard. And if they did something even slightly wrong, the punishment would be harsh. But if somebody did something very harsh towards them, there would be no punishment. So Brigham Young, sitting in Utah with the U.S. Army on his doorstep, is saying, I don't want to give the Army any pretense for violence.
Or Congress.
Or Congress either.
He's also hoping Congress is going to rescind Buchanan's decision, which ultimately they do. So he wants to win in the court of public opinion. So why would he want to murder innocent people?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense. It makes no sense.
Another point that Will made, and I'd be curious to hear your guys' opinions on, I remember, once again, going back to Blood Atonement, Lee chose the firing squad rather than beheading, which I did not know beheading was legal.
Or hanging. He had three choices. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there were three choices. But the idea was, according to Will Bagley, if Lee felt that he was guilty where he needed to be blood atoned, he would have chosen beheading, because that's the only way blood atonement works, is to shed your blood. Whereas since he chose firing squad, in Lee's mind, he wasn't guilty of a blood atonement sin. Do you have any comments on that?
We know that Lee did not consider himself to be guilty of sin in carrying out the massacre, strangely. I mean, we have witnesses at his trial.
They weren't innocent blood, is that why?
Well, they were innocent people, but what he claimed was that, and he said this repeatedly throughout his life, this was his conscience salve, if you will. He kept saying, I have done nothing designedly wrong or deliberately wrong. Our motives were pure. In other words, they felt like they had to do it to protect their own people, to wipe out these witnesses. And in many ways, he was using the Nuremberg defense. An officer told me to do it, and therefore, in this case, Isaac Kate and William Dame. So
Lee's descendants still use that as justification.
It is, but of course, when you're talking about something like murder, you cannot justify the commission of murder by saying, somebody told me to do it. You just can't. You can seek a lesser punishment or a lesser conviction if you felt like you were pressured by somebody to do it, but it doesn't take away the fact you killed the person. So Lee, in his rationalization, honestly believed that he hadn't done anything designedly wrong or something that would somehow put his eternal salvation at stake. And so he really didn't believe that what he did at the massacre was shedding innocent blood in a way that required him to go to a lesser kingdom. It's a strange rationalization. Yeah. And I think Lee, and we have a letter from his son, it's David Lee, writes his father before his father is executed. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, look, if you are guilty for what you're accused of doing, for killing people, then by being executed, essentially you can atone for your sins and you will be able to go to the celestial kingdom, the highest kingdom. So that there is definitely evidence that he did believe in blood atonement, or at least his son was saying, if this is true, Dad, then blood atonement will wipe away your sin. Giving your life to make up for what you did will allow you to go to the celestial kingdom. So, Lee's blood was shed. 5 bullets went through his chest. Some of them went through the back. His blood was spilt.
So is firing squad, this just seems like a weird question, but I just remember Will kind of dwelling on this a little bit. Is firing squad an appropriate way to be blood atoned? We want to answer that question, we want to refer you to the forthcoming work by Mike Homer on blood atonement in Utah.
From
Signature Books?
Yes, from Signature Books. So, like I said, we do delve into blood atonement and avenging the blood of the prophets in our book. But I've realized that when I was looking for what I could cite on it, there is no book-length treatment on blood atonement. And so as director of Signature Books, I asked Mike Homer, who is an attorney here in Utah, who's been studying the death penalty in Utah and how blood atonement has affected that. I asked him to write the first book-length treatment digging into blood atonement so people once and for all can really understand what it was and what it was not.
Okay. And
so look for that from Signature Books.
We can get past this idea that the immigrants were blood atoned.
Yeah, it doesn't line up with the doctrine.
It doesn't.
It because these people weren't, they had nothing to do with Parley P. Pratt's murder. Parley P. Pratt was murdered by a man from San Francisco, Hector McLean, who was chasing him across the country because Hector's wife had left him and had become Parley's plural wife. So he's chasing him across the country. He happens to catch up with him in Arkansas and murders him there. The people who were massacred at Mountain Meadows had nothing to do with Parley P. Pratt's murder. So it does not line up with the doctrine.
Well, it's been a post-crime justification for why the immigrants deserve to die, right?
Definitely.
Was the Pratt murder?
Yep. No. And that's the other thing that's really interesting we also looked at is none of the perpetrators ever give that as a reason for why the crime was carried out.
But it's been
Lee
folklore,
says
though.
it becomes folklore after the case, but none of the perpetrators ever said that was their motive.
Right.
Lee says they were members of the mob in Missouri and Illinois on September 29th, 1857, and that they had poisoned Indians and Mormons as they're passing through the territory. That's the reason that Lee gives, the earliest reason. The rumor about it being in retribution for Parley P. Pratt's murder starts in California when a California newspaper editor learns the second train I was talking about, the Turner Dukes train that comes through, they knew the people that were massacred. And when they arrive in California, they start sharing that these people were from Arkansas. A newspaper editor writes, oh, they're looking for a motive. Why would the Mormons be involved in this? And he says, Parley P. Pratt was murdered in Arkansas in May. This must be in revenge for Parley's murder. But again, there is no evidence that supports that from any of the perpetrators' side. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I published an article on that topic, Parley P. Pratt and the Mountain Meadows Massacre, that's in a collection of articles that are edited by Matt Groh and published by University of Oklahoma Press. So if people want more on that idea, I'd refer them to my article.
And I've thought a lot, working on this project for 18 years, why is it so important to people, to some, to hold on to this is in revenge for Parley P. Pratt's murder? It's because it comes down to motive. And if you're looking for a motive and you want to say the motive is based on religious fanaticism, that's the only motive there is. It always goes back to these religious fanatics, blood atoned, these people, because they were from Arkansas and Parley was killed in Arkansas. We go so much deeper and based on primary sources and thorough research, it's all documented in our book, we come up with far more well-documented, like it makes it clear what was going on in 1857 that led to this horrific crime.
So
why were they killed? It was a cover-up.
Yeah.
For a botched cattle raid.
So there is a cover-up.
There's a cover-up.
Brigham's not involved in the cover-up. Or is he?
So on Brigham Young and the cover-up, so let me just talk about the motive first. Or maybe, do you want to talk about it?
No, you go ahead.
So basically what happens is Isaac Haight sends John D. Lee out to attack the train. To raid the cattle. After he does that, he holds a council meeting on Sunday in Cedar City. His council does not support his decision. He sends two people out to call Lee off. Before they get there, Lee has jumped the gun because he's told, don't attack them till they've gone down into the valley of the Santa Clara River where you can be up on the cliffs and, raid the cattle that way. John D. Lee jumps the gun and decides, we're going to attack them now. They're sitting ducks here in the Mountain Meadows. So they do attack them there. They go further than they should have. People die. And then these two...
He tripped over the guy.
He trips
he
over...
wakes up a herdsman who alerts the company.
And this is on September 7th, roughly.
September 7th. That's right.
Then the two guys who go down to call him off, they run into a couple of immigrants who aren't in the circled wagons. They're immigrants who are gathering stray cattle that are behind.
So they don't know that their company is under siege at the Mountain Meadows.
Oh.
But after the two men from Cedar City find out that the company's been attacked and people have died, they thought, we've got to kill these people to contain the situation. So they shoot one and kill him, and the other one gets back. He's injured, but he gets back to the company, and he says, these aren't Indians. These are white men who are killing us. And it's at that point that they think, if we let them go on to California now, at the time an army's coming to us from the east, they'll bring an army from the west, and we'll be pinched in between. It's either our families or their families, and they make the horrendously horrible decision to wipe out all the families that are at the Mountain Meadows.
except for the children too young to tell tales. So they're wiping out witnesses.
That they all were under 8.
They were all under 7.
Yeah.
The oldest was 6. Most of them were babies and toddlers. Yeah, and some babies and younger children were killed at the massacre.
Right, that's what I meant. Because I know that there's been another myth that Mormons were accountable at age 8. And
that just, again, it does not stand up to the sources.
Some
the oldest, there were 7-year-olds killed, there were babies killed, there were children younger than 8 that were killed. And again, the perpetrators, everybody involved in it, they all say again and again, repeatedly in different sources, they killed all the children too young to tell tales. In other words, they could never testify as to what happened to their families.
Again, it was all about cover-up. It wasn't about somehow sparing the innocent.
Yeah, it was about cover-up. So the massacre itself was a cover-up.
Okay. And so then was Brigham in any way involved in a cover-up? I know Will Bagley's like, well, there's a page ripped out of some diary and wish we had that letter. Brigham wrote, "Oh, let him go." But in the first letter that we don't have, it was kill everybody. When
Brigham Young got his first reports of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, they first came as a rumor, interesting, through Utes. A word reached Salt Lake City through a Ute leader that California-bound immigrant company had been wiped out. By that time, Brigham Young had written his letter saying, "Let them go." And so when John D. Lee shows up and says they've all been killed, Brigham Young says, "Well, what happened?" He says, "The Indians did it." Okay? So that's the first report that he gets, and it sickens him enough that we have a clerk that day writing that Brigham Young is sick and had to go to his mill to sort of, try to recuperate. So what happens after that? Well, what happens is that Brigham Young at that point is thinking, I've got an army on my doorstep and an American company's been wiped out here in my territory. So he's not eager to share that news with anybody anytime soon. So between 1857 and 1859, he's not sharing that news. What he tells Jacob Hamlin, when Jacob Hamlin comes up in 1858 with a different story than the one John D. Lee tells him, Brigham Young says to him, "We are going to take this to court when we can feel confident that justice will be done by the courts." And so that early part is Brigham Young being cagey about it. He definitely is, okay? He's not just going to the army and saying, "Oh, guess what? A company's been massacred on our territory." But by the time you get to 1859, Brigham Young is hearing a lot of things that are very disturbing to him. And at that point, he's saying, it's time. It's time to have this prosecuted. That's when he makes his offer to bring in those who are suspects in the massacre, to bring in witnesses, and to get this case tried. And from 1859 until the end, that's his goal, to get this case tried.
Another thing that's really convincing to me is in chapter 4, we go into this, but William Dame and Isaac Haight, who are the armchair leaders of the massacre, they're not there. They're at their homes in Parowan and Cedar City when the massacre occurs. They ride out the middle of the night. They arrive early in the morning of September 12th in the darkness. And they discover that there's 17 surviving children that are screaming, crying in Rachel Hamlin's shanty. Jacob Hamlin is in Salt Lake City. He's not around. So they discover that the deed has been done. And then they ride south and they see just blood-spattered corpses throughout the valley. And they're horrified by what they see. And they start arguing over who is going to report this to Brigham Young and how are they going to report it. Isaac Haight says, you've got to report it as an all-Indian massacre. And Dame says, I'm not so sure I should report it that way. Dame knows he's given permission for Haight to call it the militiamen to participate in this. They argue over it and how on earth are we going to tell Brigham Young about this? If Brigham Young had ordered it, they would have been saying, okay, who gets credit for saying this, right? But instead they're like, oh boy, we're in trouble. Who's going to take the blame for this and how are we going to report it? And then ultimately,
come back where Brigham Young said, let them go? Because I don't think it's come back
the letter,
yet,
no, it hasn't yet. Yeah. It hasn't yet. It comes the next morning, September 13th. So this is on September 12th. So, but they're just stunned. William Dame says he's horrified. And he says, I didn't know there were so many women and children, which could be true because Dame hadn't been at the Meadows before that. And so, they may not have known how many women and children were inside that wagon train. And so he's horrified when he sees most of the people killed were children. And he's horrified when he sees what he is given permission for. So again, he and Haight argue over who's responsible for this. And Haight says, well, you ordered me to do this. And Dame says, well, show me the papers for that. I didn't write anything down. Show me the papers for that. So there's this argument going on. And several of the perpetrators who witnesses talk about it. So we know this argument happened. And again, if Young had ordered it, why are they arguing over what they're going to tell Brigham Young and how and who's going to take responsibility for it? And later, Isaac Haight convinces John D. Lee to be the one to go up and tell Brigham Young about the massacre. And Lee lies to Young. He says it's an all-Indian massacre, that the white settlers were sent out to help bury the dead or save the immigrants. But when they get there, it's too late. And so they just buried the dead.
And then, of course, through the years, the key people responsible for the massacre, Isaac Haight, William Dame, John D. Lee, John Higbee, and others, Philip Clingan Smith, they all point the other direction. So John D. Lee would say, wasn't my idea. The only reason I got involved is because Isaac Haight invited me to make the initial attack, and he's the one that sent down the final orders to attack, and therefore I'm not responsible, Haight's responsible. Haight would say, wait a minute.
Is this why he wouldn't implicate Dame? Because he really felt Haight was more responsible?
Well, Dame was in prison, and Lee didn't want to give any information that would convict anybody who was in prison.
Oh.
But then Haight would point to Dame and say, well, Dame was the one that he was my military superior. He's the one that gave the final order. And besides, I had tried to call off John D. Lee. And if he hadn't been so impetuous, this thing never would have happened.
So they blame it on Lee.
And then Dame is saying,
blaming each other.
Yeah, they're all pointing the finger at each other, and there's actually blame enough to go around with all of them. Dame is saying, well, I wouldn't have said what I said about authorizing it if I thought there were so many women and children. I thought they were mostly dead anyway, and I didn't realize there were all the women and children. That was Haight's doing. His lies to me are the ones. So they're all pointing their finger at each other and trying to somehow salve their conscience and say, I'm not responsible, when they were all responsible.
Yeah, if Brigham Young had ordered it, they could have said, Brigham Young ordered this, and then they would have walked.
And so none of them said that.
None of them did.
And
in fact,
Lee's confession that claimed that is basically a forgery.
It's in Mormonism Unveiled. That book is. And then also very convincing to me is repeatedly people come to Lee and they want him to point to Young after he's convicted and he's on death row, essentially. They keep saying, if you tell us more, you can have your freedom. And he repeatedly says again and again in his journal and to all these folks, he keeps saying, Brigham Young knew nothing about the Mountain Meadows Massacre until it was all over, and very much regretted hearing about it when he did. He says that over and over. And again, if Lee wanted to, if he had pointed to Brigham Young, if Brigham Young had ordered it, it would have been easy just to say he did. Or even though he didn't, he still wouldn't say that Young did it. He could have walked if he had done so, but he doesn't.
So at the very end of his life, Lee hated Brigham Young.
Yeah,
he hated him with a passion, okay? Yeah. So people might ask, so why is it that a man who has murdered people, who has lied and lied and lied and lied, why won't he just say something that will convict Brigham Young and allow himself to walk? And the answer is actually theological. John D. Lee is in his 60s. He knows he's not going to live a lot longer. His mind is on the next life. And he has been taught that you cannot go to the celestial kingdom if you have shed innocent blood. He's rationalized in his mind that what he did at Mountain Meadows was not shedding innocent blood because he was just doing it without any animus towards those people, just following orders.
And to save the lives of the Latter-day Saints by killing the witnesses.
So he doesn't think that that's prohibiting him from going to the celestial kingdom, the highest Latter-day Saint heaven. But he knows Brigham Young's innocent, and that if he says something that sends Brigham Young to the gallows or the firing squad, then he'll be guilty of shedding innocent blood. So even though he hates Brigham Young's guts at this point, he won't do it for his eternal salvation because he knows Brigham Young's innocent.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Barbara Jones Brown and Rick Turley. Our next conversation with them will be our last, and it's only available for free to newsletter subscribers. So to hear the final part of our conversation, sign up to our free newsletter at gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and this is what we're going to talk about.
One of the ways to look at this is to say there's plenty of blame to go around.
Sure.
President Buchanan, Brigham Young,
the
local people, folks generally who were committing violence during this time period. When you look at causation from either a logical or a legal perspective, what you generally do is you want to go back to find out who's really responsible for the crime. In this case, the local ringleaders in southern Utah are the ones who initiate what goes on with the initial attack. And Isaac Haight can say, well, I was calling off John D. Lee, but he was the one that set him in motion.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, subscribe on either Patreon or at gospeltangents.com. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire audio uninterrupted. On our $10 tier, if you would like to see the whole video, you can see that either on youtube.com/gospeltangents, or I've got a special Facebook group devoted for full videos. So subscribe at gospeltangents.com and sign up for just $10 a month. For $20 a month, if you'd like to get some bonus content, maybe some of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor, you can sign up for that. And then if you'd like to talk to me for $100 a month, we'll do a monthly phone call on something like Zoom, and you can ask me anything you want. So thanks again. Also, don't forget about the merch, mugs, t-shirts, hats, things like that. I'm trying to get the ties up there. Hopefully I can get up there. And thanks again for watching Gospel Tangents, and click here for some more videos.